Thank you guys for joining. Let's kick things off. As everyone's probably aware, last week, John published a new article, another one of his masterpieces, that kind of kicked off or reignited an old debate about rollups, sovereignty, bridging, a lot of things that run to the very core of blockchains. And Kelvin was a co-author on that post, and then also he wrote a follow-up post earlier this week, which I thought was also a masterpiece. John wrote a follow-up post. There was a lot of debates on Twitter. I think Toghrul was, one of the more like salient, coherent critics of some of the positions that were made in those posts. And so we just wanted to get people together to talk about this topic and go deeper and kind of unravel and get to the bottom of this conversation. So that's why we're here. And I wanted to start with just a round of intros for our guests and for people who do not already know them. I'm Nick, COO at Celestia Labs, by the way. But yeah, why don't we do a round of intros? Kelvin, why don't you start?
Sure. Okay. Hi, I'm Kelvin. Hope people can hear me properly. Yeah, it seems like it's working. Um, Kelvin, also smart contracts on various different platforms, and um, been working on layer two stuff for a long time now. Originally with Plasma, and then obviously with optimistic rollups in the optimism sphere. Um, yeah, originally did a lot of engineering. Now moving into more sort of DevRel stuff. So a lot of fun.
Cool. John, Toghrul.
Hey everyone, I'm John. I'm one of the co-founders over at DBA, primarily infrastructure broadly focused research and investing. Mostly spend my time writing about rollups and posting memes about them.
Hello, my name is Toghrul. I do research at Scroll. I mostly focus on the protocol side, so the bridge design, incentives, decentralization, stuff like that. You probably can see me shit posting on Twitter quite a lot. That's what I mostly do at my job.
Awesome. Um, yeah, a lot of shit posting. That's what this group is really. That's the true full-time job. Um, so to start things off, I wanted to just frame the debate and get everyone's sort of like baseline like position and like establish the context for the audience. So, what is this roll-ups equal bridges debate about? Can someone kind of summarize it, assuming that people have some baseline knowledge of the various like components, so we don't have to like define everything from scratch? Does someone want to take a stab?
Sure, I can take a stab at this. I mean, I think everyone kind of has a different perspective on like what even the debate is, and so I think that's part of part of what we kind of need to figure out here. Um, I think from the perspective that John and I have been coming at this, it's essentially looking at the way that people think about rollups today and acknowledging that there are certain dynamics within that structure that aren't typically talked about, right? That we kind of ignore, we kind of say we kind of hand wave away a little bit by saying that they're not particularly important, and and we have this sort of concept of the sovereign rollup and the rollup, and I think that there is a little bit of confusion about what these things are and how they differ, and I think the stance that the sort of rollup does not equal bridge side takes is that there's this spectrum on which these systems operate, and the delineation is not as clean as maybe we sort of historically would have thought, and that a lot of that perspective comes from the history of how these systems were built and which systems came first and all these different things. But now, we're kind of looking at this, we're trying to look at this in a little bit of a deeper sense and say, well, what are the actual dynamics happening under the hood? Like, what could happen? What is happening? How do we expect these systems to work in the future?
John, Toghrul, do you guys have anything to add?
Yeah, I would second that. Yeah, like the kind of what a lot of it comes down to is like we think of today's smart contract rollups versus like the extreme other end of sovereign rollups as these like completely distinct far ends of the spectrum, and like it's one or the other, and they have like completely different properties. And while that like makes sense in the practical sense, because like we're used to thinking about sovereign rollups as this like complete other end of the spectrum kind of like idea that doesn't even really exist yet, as opposed to smart contract rollups where they are very much today on like that very far end of the spectrum, where it's like honestly a pretty good description to say that like the bridge defines the rollup, and like at least in the practical sense of like when we're looking at the two biggest rollups today, like yeah, the bridge is basically all that matters, because without the bridge, like those rollups today are completely reliant on it. But trying to like actually pull that apart, because the reality is like it's a lot messier, and there is very much a spectrum between those two things. And like I think the very practical reality is that in the not so distant future, it's not going to be okay, you're on this one at far end of the spectrum or the other far end of the spectrum. And like we have to understand like the interplay of those different things, because like I think a lot of us have a general idea of like what a general notion of what rollups give us, whether that's inheriting, security, trust minimization, bridging, and so on. But like a lot of our understandings of like fundamentally where those things come from is like often incorrect and like honestly hard to kind of pin down. So understanding where they actually come from, as we think about designing these going forward, when the systems will, just from a practical perspective, change a lot, is very important.
I feel like if we remove the social consensus out of the equation, the delineation between what I call classic rollups and sovereign rollups becomes much more clear here. The problem is that we don't really have a concrete definition of what social consensus is. You can use multiple different versions, define it in multiple ways, and so I don't like involving social consensus in the concrete definitions of things, because if you involve social consensus, you can always say that nothing that we're using right now is actually concrete, because everything can be changed based on the social consensus. And so basically the entire field that we have spent the last 15 years building, all the knowledge that we've been building, is worth nothing, because at the end of the day, it's all social consensus.
Okay, so I'm hearing a lot of different things. One is that the delineation or definition between sovereign rollups and what we call smart contract rollups is not quite as clear as like we once thought, and maybe the boundaries are like really fuzzy. And then John is also saying that the like rollups today are very dependent on the bridge potentially, but that doesn't mean that it will always be the case. And I think there's a lot to unpack there in terms of like what does it mean to be dependent on a bridge? Like what does that enshrined contract like provide or not provide? And then Toghrul's getting to the aspect of like social consensus and forking as one of the mechanisms that defines sovereignty. But then when you define like that's something that is like itself so just like inherent that like maybe that's like using that to make a definition is not useful. Um, so I think that's at least kind of what I'm taking away from what you guys are saying so far, and we'll definitely dig in a little bit more. But I'm curious why you guys think this debate matters. Like, why are people so uh, I don't know, like triggered by this? And like, why do you guys care so much about like debating it? Like, what is at stake in this conversation?
I mean, from from my perspective, this has always been, I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone building one of these systems, and for me, it's just about understanding more deeply, what these systems are and how they might behave. I think I think there's an argument to be made about how this impacts sort of the user's ability to make decisions within these systems. But in a lot of ways, it's kind of for me and for other system designers where I want people to, we want to be realistic about the practical reality, but we also want to be sort of rigorous about the fundamental reality. And those abstractions, those practical abstractions, are very important, but we can't ignore the more fundamental reality. So, I mean, Jon also feels strongly about this from a user perspective, so I'll give it to Jon for that.
Yeah, it's definitely a mix of a lot of things. I mean, like a lot of the pushback from people, understandably, is like, "Oh, this is semantics." To which my reply is probably, it kind of is semantics, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Quite frankly, like if like we're fumbling around at kind of what these things even fundamentally are, and like where exactly a lot of these properties come from that we're talking about, like where does the security come from? Where is the social consensus in this thing? Like where does it matter? Like that has a lot of very practical implications for what we're building and how people end up interacting with them. I think a lot of what we need to just kind of level set on is like there's a handful of 50 to 100 people who say like, oh, like all of this is intuitive, so I don't need a better mental model. And like for those 50 to 100 people who are building these systems, like yeah, I mean, like most of them are not going to understand rollups better by reading at like a technical level of like anything that I wrote. A lot of it is just like fundamentally rethinking though, like what are the important things here and like how do we communicate them and how do we build in reflection of that? And like even amongst the like quote unquote experts, like it's impossible to keep up with this, how constantly changing it is. I mean, like the simple example being like this new kind of definition of sovereign rollups that has come up over the last couple of months. Like not something I redefined it as, just like the way that we initially thought of sovereign rollups was like, okay, there's no enshrined bridge, and like that means that like you can fork it whenever but you can't have a trust minimized bridge. Like once you have a trust minimized bridge with another chain, like it's not sovereign anymore. But as we've seen, for example, like with like the great posts that like Sovereign Labs has had, I was like, there's kind of these different notions of sovereignty. The like technical, like more like source of truth kind of notion of sovereignty versus like this practical, like social ability to fork the chain. Like those are very different, like rapidly evolving things that like even when I talk to people who are building rollups today, we're like are not aware of that delineation. And like that does have meaningful implications on like a very practical and technical level of like how do we build these things? Like, does the user's source of truth need to be just like I run an Ethereum full node and I look at the bridge, or is it reasonable to distribute proofs P2P first and like they can perceive faster finality even from a Litecoin perspective, and then the bridge can just finalize it later. Like that is like a very meaningful technical and practical different way to build the system and reflection of the fact that like we're understanding that the bridge is not the only like source of truth in the world. So like that fundamental just framing is like very important on like a very direct and practical level. And a lot of it is also just what I was saying of like, none of this is intuitive. And I think all of us can get a lot better at like just explaining to the other 99.9% of people how this stuff works, because like that is very practical user implications. I mean, like the simple example being of like one that I wrote about on like USDC, which like I think a lot of people understandably like get confused on. And like Bartek had a poll on it and like had a bunch of amazing threads that like described it very well. But I also, I mean, like similarly in that vein, like it is confusing. Like I talked to a number of other people who are like experts who are building infrastructure projects in crypto and like asked them out of curiosity, like, what do you think is safer? Like native USDC on a rollup or the bridged version from the L1? And get a variety of different answers and confusion on that. And like, it's not intuitive. Like what happens if I have a native asset on the L2 that like, I burn it there, or I lock it, like I mint it somewhere else. Like none of that stuff is intuitive. And like when we frame everything through this notion of the bridge, like it gives very clear implications to people who don't understand these things well. Understandably, that like we're going to come up with like incorrect notions. Like one of the very simple examples is if like we keep saying that like the bridge is basically this like source of truth, that's the only way that you get security. Like the implication from that I very commonly see is that people often still don't understand that like sovereign rollups they can absolutely be secure. And like I very frequently see like, oh, like the operator can just take all of your money because there's no bridge contract that like enforces things, which is just fundamentally not true. So like it's a mix of, for ourselves from the designer perspective of like fundamentally understanding them, and then also a mix of like how do we communicate these things better, because I think a lot of this is very confusing the way that we're describing it.
Yeah, I strongly agree. I mean, I think that to both of you guys' points, as people who are building in the modular stack, it's important that we have the right mental models to know how these systems behave, as Kelvin said, and that informs the way that we will, like the kind of things that we'll build and we'll build for. And then also kind of to your point, John, like the broader perception of how rollups work, may not be accurate because it kind of started from a like sort of a different perspective, but in light of sort of like the new way that we're viewing things, users need to be more informed, basically of the security or the trade-offs or like what can actually happen or how rollups really work. Toghrul, I'm curious to hear your perspective on why this debate matters.
For me, it matters because of the preciseness of the terminology. Like all of us have been throwing around a lot of words like trustless, decentralized, trust minimized, whatever. And I can bet if you put 20 rollup researchers in one room and ask them for a definition of rollup, of what a rollup is, none of them will agree on the definition. And that's how basically we don't even agree on the fundamentals, let alone on like specific details of how things are implemented, etc. And so it's difficult for a user to understand what the security properties of a certain protocol is, or a family of protocols where when even the people who are working on it can't agree on what the security properties are. And so this debate is important for us to understand it so we can standardize what we communicate, and then it's much easier for the user to see, oh yeah, it's a roll up with this assumptions, or like, oh, this is Validium that uses these assumptions for this particular property and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's kind of frustrating when the definitions of things keep changing out from under us, and it definitely seems for sovereign rollups that's something that has been sort of shifting over time. So, John, you mentioned something about the difference between technical sovereignty and social sovereignty, and I know that you mentioned that in your post. I think that sort of like idea originated sort of with like Mustafa and probably Preston from Sovereign Labs, but I think you articulated it well. I think that's a really important point to get across because it kind of delineates between this idea of like social consensus versus like the source of truth for how people are actually able to get the latest like secure state from the rollup. So could you maybe explain a bit about that?
Yeah, happy to. And this is part of the reason why, for what it's worth, I'm doubtful of us having these like canonical definitions that are going to stick, is because of this is the perfect example of like our understanding of these systems is fundamentally just constantly changing, and we're coming up with new ideas and new constructs that will just fundamentally change like how we think about these systems. So the simple example of that is like what I was starting to describe a little bit before, is like these different kind of notions of what sovereignty means. So there's this delineation kind of now between like technical sovereignty and social sovereignty, where the technical sovereignty is referring more to like where do users get the quote unquote like source of truth of like what is the canonical chain, is this valid, etc. And the expectation today in Ethereum rollups is that, okay, if say take a ZK rollup, we're posting ZK proofs and we post them to the bridge. So the assumption is like if I'm running an Ethereum full node, like embedded within that is a light client of the rollup, which is the bridge. It checks that proof, so now I know I've implicitly like I have verified the rollup, and this bridge is checking the fork choice rule. It's enforcing censorship resistance. Like I could send my transaction to the Arbitrum inbox contracts, and like it will enforce that I get included if I'm getting censored, etc. But you can get the source of truth in a different manner. So the example of like what Sovereign Labs has been posting, like that they're thinking about doing is, okay, like it's expensive to post these proofs and verify them on chain. So why don't we just like generate them in real time and distribute them P2P to light clients? And now the source of truth is no longer the bridge for these rollup users. I can run a rollup light client, get a proof, and I'm good to go. And like it fundamentally changes how you have to build these things, because like usually the bridge is also, it's enforcing the fork choice rule, it's enforcing the censorship resistance in the way that, like as I mentioned with Arbitrum's inbox contract, like we're showing that, hey, like this transaction was submitted, we're going to force include it even if the sequencer didn't want to. So they're going to have their DK proofs built in a different manner here, such that like, okay, we're proving that we scanned the DA layer and like we looked for transactions that are eligible to force include, and we're proving that like we've included this, and therefore like we follow the fork choice rule and like we implement that and prove it directly within the proof. So I don't need the bridge anymore. But at the same time, we can still have a bridge contract, and then like we'll post proofs later and batch them every once in a while when we need to settle to the bridge, and the bridge also gets finality. But that's, as I mentioned, expensive to do that on chain, so we only do that periodically. So your change is like fundamentally, we can still have this bridge, but there's a different source of truth to the users, and we built the proofs in like a different manner to reflect that. The more traditional notion of like sovereignty that we think about is this like ability to fork, and that's the kind of like social sovereignty. And the thing here is like this is also kind of like a practical spectrum again, where we think of it as like, okay, if this rollup has an official bridge, well, that means you're not sovereign and you can't fork. And if you don't have this bridge, that means you're sovereign and you can socially fork whenever you want. But again, the reality of that is like very practical and fuzzy. You could take the simple example of like, I've given like a social media application of like, let's say there's like barely any money in the bridge and like all the valuable state is user data. In that case, like you probably can fork away from the bridge if like the governance token holders are getting greedy and they're extracting rent, and all the users say like, screw this, we're going to make another rollup. We read over the data. There's barely any money in the bridge. We don't care about it. We force withdrawal. So like they have that social ability to fork in that case, even though they have the bridge. While on the other side, you could have a sovereign rollup, like quote unquote in the traditional definition, where like there is no official bridge. But what if there's a bunch of USDC on the chain that's natively deployed, and USDC doesn't want to go along with the fork that they go along with? Well, then you're imposing the same cost on that of like, if we fork away from this and the majority of our value is native USDC, like obviously your practical social sovereignty has gone down. So is this like quote unquote sovereign rollup more sovereign than the smart contract rollup I just described because it doesn't have a bridge? Like I would certainly argue no, because like you're clearly imposing like a much higher practical cost on to socially fork, and as a result, like it's completely infeasible to do so most likely. So understanding that like there are these very different notions, and they're very much a spectrum, and like it's not this always clear black and white between like what is sovereign and what isn't, particularly from the social perspective. And then also on the like the technical sovereignty perspective, again, like that has very direct technical and practical implications of how we build these systems in light of thinking about like what does the bridge actually provide us. So all of that is just like very fundamentally important to understand.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's a very clean like technical definition of sovereignty, like a sovereign rollup versus a smart contract rollup. But then as soon as you start to consider the social dimension of it, it all of a sudden gets very gray, where sure, you may not have it, quote, enshrined the bridge, into like the source of truth of your chain, but then the fact that you have, let's say you do have a bridge with another chain, you are in some sense giving up your sovereignty, because you either, if you want that bridge to be trust minimized, when you fork, you're going to have to like basically sacrifice those assets, and it causes it increases the cost of actually forking. So it does in some sense decrease your sovereignty. So then it's like, is any rollup like, is the only rollup that can be sovereign one in which there are no bridges? And so we should just like give up on the idea of sovereign rollups, because it's never going to be practical, or not. And like I don't know, I'm curious, Kelvin or Toghrul, like how do you guys see this? Do you think there's like a tension here? Do you think that the definition is clear, or is it just fuzzy inherently?
I feel like as soon as you bring up social consensus, it inherently becomes fuzzy. So, for example, even in this example, this example of, oh yeah, it's sovereign because if the majority of your assets are on the L2, you can just fork away, only works if you assume that all those assets, all those token holders that are native to the L2 agree with the fork. But let's say, what if I have an NFT collection on an L2 that derives most of its value from the fact that there's a trust minimized bridge with Ethereum. And as soon as you fork it, my value drops, so I won't support it. So I will accept the previous fork, so the canonical chain that has the trust minimized bridge as the one that my collection is going to support. And you can come up with a lot of examples like that. And in that case, basically the social consensus of the protocol is completely different from the social consensus of the tokens that are deployed on top of that particular L2, which means that the value doesn't really matter that much. It's just about who agrees with you and who doesn't. And at the same time, you can always bring up social consensus. So for example, is a sovereign rollup not a rollup because I can fork the rollup and add a transaction in the middle of the finalized batches that has never been submitted on chain? Does that mean that the current version of my sovereign rollup is not actually a rollup? Because from the definition of the rollup, I can't really reconstruct the state because one of the transactions doesn't have data on chain. It's just a question of, do we consider like a hypothetical scenario in which you can fork and create something else? Does that have an impact on the definition that we currently operate in? Or do we just like chalk it off to social consensus, and basically social consensus can do whatever it wants in crypto, or to be fair, in any single, yeah.
I mean, one response to this is essentially that I don't think you can just ignore social consensus. Like social consensus is a real thing. It exists. It's like how we fork blockchains, but it's also real in the world in general, right? Like many things are essentially just social constructions. The example I gave in my blog post was Coke, like Coca-Cola, right? In the 1950s, there's some recipe for Coca-Cola. Then in the 80s, they try to turn it into New Coke, and social consensus basically says, nope, New Coke is not close enough to still be called Coke, so we're not going to accept it. And then today you have like a different recipe of Coca-Cola, which has high fructose corn syrup in it instead of cane sugar and whatever, instead of cocaine in it. And we still call this thing Coke, right? We still say, like, if I go out to a bodega and I like get a can of Coke, I'm not like, this isn't real Coke because it's not from like, I could say that. I could say like, oh, the only real Coke was the first recipe that was ever created. And like I could say that forever, but that's a pedantic point, and everyone's basically just going to say that doesn't make any sense. I think this is real Coke. And the other side of this is also that I think this starts to get at like fundamentally what we're trying to do with these blockchains. I think people often take this stance that somehow these systems are like as fundamental as physics. And the reality is that what these systems are they're all approximations of social constructions that we've created for efficiency purposes, right? And the simpler the social construction is, the simpler the process of approximating that social construction as code is, and the less likely that you have a split is. But the more complex the social construction, the harder it is to reflect as code. And at the end of the day, these systems are not these like arbitrary things that we've created to enforce technology onto people. They are constructed explicitly to simplify the process of enforcing some or describing some social construction as code, right? And we understand that you can get efficiency gains that way. But we can't just say that like social consensus doesn't exist. I think that if you take that stance, then of course you can have this very black and white view. But fundamentally, social consensus always exists. And what we want to look at is what are the different power dynamics within the social consensus process that might lead to one result or another?
Yeah, but my argument isn't that you should just ignore social consensus. Obviously, social consensus is there and it'll always be there. It's just a question of should it impact our concrete definitions? Because you can apply the same thing, the same social consensus argument to literally anything. Or so do the cryptographic properties of signatures matter? Oh no, because we can just ignore those signatures. So yeah, there are no cryptographic properties. Or like, does a certain consensus mechanism have finality guarantees? Oh no, it doesn't matter because the social consensus can just ignore those properties. And that's my argument here. It's not that social consensus doesn't exist or it should be completely ignored. But my argument is that it shouldn't impact the concrete definitions that we use to define things.
The counterpoint here is essentially that we should look at this in a more rigorous way and look at the spectrum along which social consensus operates, right? If you have a system where all of the economic value on the system is entirely bridged assets, then you understand that to fork that system, you would be forfeiting the value of all of these assets. So there's this massive cost to any fork. And so we understand that the bridge has an enormous amount of power within that sort of system. If on the other side of the spectrum, you have a system where there's a tiny bridge, it's trustless, it's whatever, right? You know, it's a standard like Ethereum rollup setup, but it's a tiny bridge and it only has one USDC worth of something in it, then to fork that system, we're not forfeiting very much at all. And so that bridge doesn't have as much power over the social consensus process of the rollup. And the point being made is that I don't think you can say that there is an extreme on one end or the other, where on one extreme you can completely ignore social consensus, and on the other extreme you completely ignore the bridge. The reality is that there's always this sort of middle ground where this power dynamic between the bridge and other actors within the system is constantly changing.
The point is that having the majority of the assets native to L2 doesn't mean that the social consensus of those assets will agree with the fork. Let's say if the protocol users will agree, the token holders of a certain token might not agree, or USDC might not agree, or
Sure.
Chainlink might not agree. And so it's difficult to quantify how easy it would be to fork only based on the value of the assets deployed. And on top of that, we are completely ignoring arbitrary messages. So for example, if let's say a certain L1 governance of a certain protocol is being done on the L2, it completely depends on the L2 for certain things to be upgraded or whatever, or certain parameters to be changed. Will those people agree with the fork or no? We also have to put value on that.
Yeah, I'm not saying that immediately assets on L2 become distinct from the social consensus pressure of the bridge. There are classes of assets, like the launch of native USDC on Arbitrum yesterday is a very like clear example of an asset class where it is very distinct from the bridge. That's not to say that the bridge, that USDC doesn't have a massive incentive, a sort of reputational incentive to follow the Arbitrum bridge, assuming the Arbitrum bridge is making sort of, good, quote, good upgrades to the system. But if there were some catastrophic event where all of a sudden the Arbitrum bridge makes changes the state transition function so that USDC can just be minted arbitrarily, there's pretty much no chance that Circle is going to follow that fork and just allow people to redeem USDC arbitrarily. They're going to make the decision to follow the version of the system where that's not the case. So it's not to say that automatically assets on the L2 are independent from the bridge, but that we can't just ignore we just have to look at the power dynamics, and this is going to be very unique to each individual system.
Can I interject for a second? Well, first of all, I want to say that I do believe, layer zero is social consensus, and that's something that at least within the Celestia community we say all the time. And so I very much agree with Kelvin's point that blockchains are a tool to automate and sort of encode what we've agreed on via social consensus. And so we can always, no matter what system you build, you could, like the root, you can always go back to the root, and change things by just getting people together and deciding to fork. But I also see, Toghrul's side as well, and someone who articulated this, I think pretty well. Kobe, I think, said this first, and then Dankrad kind of followed up with a similar tweet. But they basically said like, "Oh, you've been lied to. All ERC20 contracts are actually like sovereign, and like they can be forked at any time." And so I guess that kind of touches on the idea of like, does it become absurd at some point to keep saying that, oh well, everything comes down to social consensus at the end of the day, so therefore everything is forkable. Like where does that where do we go like too far in that line of reasoning?
I don't think there's ever a point where it's absurd. Like I saw those tweets and I thought it was funny because the reality is, if you wanted to fork one of these systems, like if you wanted to fork an ERC20, like the code is still there, but the value and the social capital that's sort of attached to the name of that token can easily be, maybe not easily, right, but can be transferred to another contract. And we have to understand that there are clear power dynamics, and we shouldn't lie to ourselves and say that the bridge has less power than it does. I mean, I think today within the major rollups, the bridge has an enormous amount of power that probably overpowers anybody else within the system. But just by the nature of these systems and by the fact that you can start to create value that is truly independent from the bridge and sort of the threat that the bridge has to delete its native assets from your chain, I don't think it's absurd at all to say that those power dynamics will shift for a lot of these systems, right? The USDC thing is a shift in the power dynamics within Arbitrum, and I assume will be the same with other systems. And as time goes on, there will be other systems that just out the gate already have these power dynamics that are very different and don't fit neatly into one side or the other.
And it has like very practical and tangible examples that like we can see why this matters and like why people need to understand like what social consensus and security assumptions am I opting into when I hold a given asset. And that is one of the things that is legitimately great about rollups, is that like you can kind of pick and choose between these different assumptions. And like one of the examples that I put in like the last post that I made, which like Patrick had pointed out is like a great example to kind of show this, is like Justin Sun, which is like, it's kind of a funny example, but like when he was holding like Steam, like during the Steam Hive hard fork, and like the chain just decided to hard fork socially and just basically like delete all of his money. Like that is something that you are opting into when you use a chain like that in that system. That would fundamentally not be the case if you have that exact same scenario and Justin Sun is holding a ton of ETH on a rollup and it's locked in the bridge, or that's locked in the bridge and like that's collateralizing some other position he has on the rollup. Then you are not subjecting yourself to any external consensus, but you get to operate in that environment. Because the rollup could want to take Justin Sun's money in this example, and there's nothing they could do because he has his money in the bridge and he is only signing up for the social consensus of Ethereum. If social consensus of Ethereum wants to fork and delete all of his money in the bridge, they could do that. But you may not want to subject yourself to an additional social consensus. And like that is like a fundamentally important trade-off that like people need to be able to understand and pick and choose between. Like there are often times where you will not want to subject yourself to that kind of social consensus, or at minimum, like you have like a real due process, and like the sense of like an on-chain governance that you know that you're signing up for, of this is what can happen to my assets if I do X. Like this is the process that I'm going to be subject to. Like that like has very meaningful and direct implications.
We have a cameo speaker who just showed up, and I'm excited to have on the mic James Prestwich, who has been chiming in on the debate in Twitter, and also just, I mean, even before this week, in the past, I've had a lot of conversations with him about this topic, and I think he has a really good point of view. And particularly, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was he had a tweet about basically, why he thinks this topic is so controversial, which we did touch on a little bit earlier. But basically, James was saying that he asked some like fundamental questions that I would love to get his take on. And he said, the questions are essentially like, do rollups actually scale the underlying L1, or are they, just a separate chain? Like, what does an ideal data availability layer look like? And do rollups actually inherit security from the underlying L1? And I think these are very spicy questions because, they change the way that we perceive rollups and the relationship to the underlying like blockchain that they're built on. James, you want to like jump in here and sort of explain your perspective on all this stuff?
Yeah, no problem. I have, really quick answers for each of those 3 points. One is Jersey doesn't scale New York, even though the bridges exist. 2 is nobody's ever asked what an ideal data availability system is, except, to some extent, Celestia, Eigenlayer. The current dialogue on rollups is a consequence of asking that question. And for number 3, inherit is deliberately chosen to imply a paternalistic relationship. It makes the rollup subordinate to the host. It is much better to say that the rollup rents data availability or buys data availability. The rollup has the same relationship to the host as any other smart contract. You wouldn't say that Uniswap inherits from Ethereum. The rollup bridge is the rollup is buying data availability. The rollup bridge is buying gas with which to verify the rollup state transition to serve users.
Oh, I thought Toghrul was going to say something.
Yeah,
I just wanted to say. Go, Toghrul.
So a couple of things. So one, do we actually have a concrete definition of scaling? Because I've heard quite a few versions, and I'm not sure if we actually have it.
Luckily, I have a long history of defining my terms.
I remember your definition of scaling, but I'm not sure if I agree with it.
Well then, I guess if you're saying up front that you don't agree with it, then the answer is no. You already know we don't have a agreed definition of scaling.
No, I just meant to ask whether there's a consensus on whether your definition is correct or not.
I have actually not seen anyone else offer a definition of scaling. So
yeah, that's a good point. Like people use it quite freely and don't really define it concretely.
Yeah. Well, this goes back to my point about inherit. People don't define what it means to inherit security. They chose the word for the sense that it creates of a hierarchical, paternal family relationship. They didn't define what inherited security is. The same way people saying that rollups scale Ethereum did not define what scaling is.
Fair. So with regards to scaling, you gave an example of Jersey and New York, but another example would be building a new district in a city. That would be scaling of a city. So it depends on what example you pick here. And I feel like with regards to scaling, I would define scale.
Well, one thing I wanted to just say, James, I really liked about your third point of, inherit. I actually never really kind of realized that paternalistic implication of that, like using that phrase. But like it really does, your point really aligns with what like within the Celestia community we've been saying for a long time, which is like, even when you say L1 and L2, it kind of implies like this relationship of like, one chain being the more fundamental or more important, of the two. And in general, like, I feel like that's something that Celestia has been trying to push against, is like this idea that rollups are baby chains, right? And that's why we've been beating the drum about sovereign rollups for so long, is like, to us, and like, for a long time, this is very contrarian. We were saying like rollups are their own blockchains in their own right. They're not just some extension of an underlying system, or at least they don't have to be. And like that's so important because, like, again, tying together Kelvin's whole point about social consensus, like social consensus is such a huge part of what blockchains are and what makes them powerful. And without sovereignty, if your rollup gives up sovereignty, then like it's not really a true blockchain, and so it's not as useful. And so like even the Cosmos community would say like, oh, I don't want to build a rollup because like then I'm not a sovereign chain. And we're like, no, it's just as sovereign as like your Cosmos zone. So anyway, I really strongly agree with that.
Rollups are really interesting to talk about because no other category of blockchain has this service provider relationship that rollups do with their host. I really don't like phrasing it as inherit, but we should look at this as like the rollup is buying from the DA host. And the service provider relationship is not a like hierarchical tiered layer 1, layer 2 relationship. But it is like very interesting, and it is fundamental to what rollups are.
Yeah, it's kind of like, like a smart contract. Is a smart contract inheriting security from Ethereum, or is it just kind of like, when you pay gas, you're paying for Ethereum to scale to secure the smart contract?
I would say it does inherit. Like you're paying to get some certain properties in return, and it's the same with the rollup. I'm paying the cost of publishing the badge to get certain guarantees in return for that.
I don't think
And so
I've ever paid for an inheritance.
Yeah, okay. But you do pay taxes though on their inheritance. So does that count?
Anyway, I don't think we need to like talk about. I don't think we have to like go into the details about like the definition of inherent or whatever. John and Kelvin, I'm curious.
Yeah, sorry to talk over you guys, John and Kelvin. Definitions are critical to what we're doing. If you can't define the term, you can't understand what's going on. Semantics is the purpose of having these discussions.
True.
One small thing Oh, sorry.
John, go ahead. No, Kelvin, whatever. Go ahead.
All right, I'll go quickly. I mean, I fully agree with a lot of this. I think we need to take the opportunity to look at the properties and kind of step away from definitions and just look very clearly at the properties, sort of abstracted from the definitions. Like it's fully correct to say that what rollups are doing, and what is interesting about rollups is that they are buying these properties, right? Ordering and possibly also data availability from another consensus mechanism, and that is a valuable thing because consensus is hard and consensus is annoying, and if you can rely on another system, right, it is a valuable thing to have. But just practically looking at what that gives you ordering, that gives you data availability. Does that, when you say it inherits security, what are you really saying? Are you saying, I think when we say that word or we say that phrase, there's this sort of implication that the sort of value of the assets or the information on these systems is inherently also as secure as what you would expect on the parent chain, and that's not true by default, and so you kind of need to, like, I really strongly just agree with this statement, but I want to I think there's like a really important opportunity just to talk and spend some time reviewing the observed properties, and then over the next couple months trying to come up with new definitions that really clearly describe the observed properties, rather than what has happened, which is that the definitions came first, the words came first, and we kind of observed the properties afterwards.
Yeah, one like small thing I would add on this kind of conversation, because I do think it is very important. This kind of like relativistic or paternalistic type relationship, and like tying that to what we actually observe, which like can be fuzzy at times, but I think we practically can observe. I mean, like this is the simple reason why I used the words L1 and L2 in the way that I did in the post of not saying it's the perfect definition, but at least for me, I think it was like actually very helpful in framing the way that I'm thinking about these things. Like more or less using those kind of terms as like, what is the ledger of record for this given asset, whether it's USDC, it's Ethereum, it's ETH, it's Optimism, etc. Like that is an important relationship to understand, like is very observable in that like if I've bridged ETH on Optimism, like I think we can all agree it's quite observable that the value of that is tied to the fact that there's some Ethereum locked in the bridge on the L1. If the bridge gets hacked on that rollup and all the ETH disappears, like I think we can pretty confidently say that like the value of that bridged ETH is going to go down a lot because now it's completely under collateralized. Like people were holding that thing in recognition of the fact that I have this ETH underlying it, and like that is what derives its value from. So like that's why I used like the L1 and L2 in like these very relativistic ways in which like a chain could be an L1 and L2 like kind of simultaneously, and like people can modify the definition, use it however. But like it does capture that like very relativistic relationship where is Ethereum like really an L1 or a rollup really an L1 for native USDC that is deployed on that chain? If like we all have the very clear and measurable understanding that this thing has value because Circle has some dollars in the bank account and they say my coin has value. If Circle decides that never mind, we're not going to honor this thing anymore, and like you're not getting your money back from the bank account, the value of that asset is going to go to zero. It's like that is like a very clear and important like relativistic relationship to like just to understand like what is the relative like power between these different chains, and like who are we trusting in these different relationships. It's not necessarily the perfect like way to frame them or anything, but just like understanding that relationship between all of these different entities that are all interacting with each other like is fundamentally important to understand.
I feel like it's not quite correct to define L1s and L2s from the perspective of the assets, because the definitions used before, like for example in Patrick's paper from 2019 on layer 2s, the definition was more from the perspective of the L1, and the same applies for L2B. So L2B defines the layer 2 from the perspective of an L1. So essentially, you can have an asset that is natively deployed on an L2, but it's still an L2 because you can essentially run an L1 full node and be ensured that the L2 is running correctly, assuming that the proof system works correctly, of course. So that's an additional assumption, and that's why we call them trust minimized. But it's difficult to define a given asset based on whether it's native or not, because there are a lot of things that play a role here. So for example, what if my L2 asset is locked and requires a message from the L1 to be unlocked, but it's still native to L2? Do we consider that to be an L1, or is that an L2?
I do want to push back on that proof-oriented look at security. The L1 can never know whether the proof system is working correctly because it does not know the state that the proof system purports to prove. It can know that some subset of the state conforms to the proof system, or it can know that the proof system has halted, but it cannot know whether the proof system corresponds to the entire rollup state. And therefore, you cannot have that guarantee that the rollup is functioning correctly. You can have some level of confidence about some portion of the rollup state.
Yeah, I think another important point here is that this is always from the perspective of an observer who chooses a particular state transition function, right? You can say you don't have universal. I think like an important point here is that these things are not absolute when we're talking about what is the real OP mainnet, what is the real Arbitrum. We're talking about the sort of social thing that we've created, and people could fork off and say that, okay, now this is the real Arbitrum, but the bridge, what the bridge gives you is a view of a particular state transition function, and that state transition function may not be the quote real Arbitrum in the sense that it's not the thing that everybody in the world is calling Arbitrum, but it is a specific state transition function. Uh, but it's not universal, right? You can't say that the bridge gives you universal access to the thing called Arbitrum, and it will always be the case that what the bridge reflects is the thing that we socially refer to as Arbitrum. That's just not true. It could very well be the case that the thing that we socially refer to as Arbitrum is completely different than what the bridge observes.
Well, neither does your full node, one full node either. You just don't know which other fork exists back then, but you are aware of the specific state of a specific fork. That doesn't mean that every single participant of the social consensus agrees that that's the canonical fork. So the same argument applies here.
Yeah, exactly. But I just wanted to push back against the sense that you have trustless access to, by running an L1 node, you have trustless access to the thing that we socially refer to as X, Y, or Z, right? You have access to enforcement over a particular state transition function.
So I like this sort of like line of conversation, but I want to tie things back a little bit more to like real systems, and I think we are getting closer to the end of our time, and specifically one of the questions I wanted to like revisit was this question of like, what does an ideal DA layer look like? Because for a long, obviously this is something that is a question that's very close to our hearts at Celestia and something that we've thought about very deeply. And one of the major design decisions of Celestia from the early days is to not include settlement. So there is no smart contract environment. There is no way to have an enshrined bridge with Celestia at the moment. And we felt strongly that was the right decision because it just didn't seem like settlement was something that was it was like a nice to have but not a must have. And the overhead of adding execution to the underlying DA, adds overhead to every rollup that wants to use it. And so it was just like not worth it. Like going more minimal was really the right approach in our minds. So I'm curious, and we used to get a lot of, I would say, like criticism for that. They're like, oh, well, there's no way to settle on Celestia, so it's like unusable, or you know what I mean. And so I'm curious if this debate sort of shifts that perspective for any of you, or like what do you think the ideal DA layer actually looks like, and is settlement a big part of that, or is it not as important? I want to open up that conversation.
I feel like it depends on a specific use case. So for Ethereum, the DA layer is specifically added to make the cost of publishing the data for the rollups that are bridging to the underlying layer cheaper. Whereas for Celestia, for example, the whole idea of DA is used for a different reason. It's used to provide. It's basically used to provide some guarantees to the chains that don't want to bootstrap all their security from the ground up. So I like to use this example, and I know James is going to push back on this, is that rollups on Ethereum are deployed to scale Ethereum, whereas on Celestia, the rollups are deployed in order to borrow some security from Celestia. So the use cases are a bit different.
I mostly agree with that, actually. Like, I do think it's use case dependent. I mean, like, there's obviously certain technical properties of, like, yeah, you want a lot of data availability, ideally validity, provable or asynchronous coding, et cetera, like that, things quickly, censorship resistant, all that kind of stuff. But like the practical reality is, yeah, like different rollups have different needs and they will want and optimize for different things. If your rollup explicitly wants, hey, we want to tap into all of the users of Ethereum, and we have all these users that want to use ETH in a different place in a trust minimized way, well, then the way that Ethereum works is great for them. If someone has no concern for the base layer assets at all and like don't care about tapping into users and liquidity, then yeah, there's no reason for them to have another settlement layer there, whatever that means. That is just like adding overhead or clogging up the chain or anything like that. Like it's just not useful to them. So like for different use cases, they're going to optimize probably for potentially like different things.
When talking about ETH as a good DA layer, we always come back to this implicit assumption that users will want trust minimized bridges. Not just bridges, but trust minimized bridges. This is the distinguishing factor for Ethereum compared to other DA environments. And I don't know if that assumption holds. I think that the majority of users have expressed a preference for non-trust minimized bridges, and that's likely to continue being the case going forward. I think that CCTP is going to be a much more important bridge than the Optimism or Arbitrum token bridge from an ecosystem perspective and from a user perspective.
Spicy. Kelvin, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there is an obvious use to these types of bridges. It is a unique property that you can have when you use Ethereum as a data availability layer, because you share access to the ordering and consensus. And sort of the practical use case is that you have pretty strong guarantees about bridged assets, right? That's like a valuable thing that you can have, and so you have access to an enormous amount of liquidity and users that already exist on Ethereum. As to whether or not people want these trust minimized bridges, I'm in the camp that there are plenty of institutional, very risk averse people who do want this, and for whom this is still not true, right? These bridges are still not good enough to get this kind of movement between the systems. But of course, it is correct to say that something like a native USDC bridge starts to change that formula, because you are sort of no longer reliant on the bridge in this very direct way. So
an institutional user is much more likely to choose Circle's CCTP than it is to choose Arbitrum or Optimism token bridge.
For USDC.
Yes.
So I think one point to keep in mind here too is that, like, at least to date, none of these like bridges, L1, L2 bridges, are trust minimized, right? Like they all have.
I was about to say this.
Yeah, so maybe that's also
except
partly
Fuel
why.
V1.
Yeah, exactly. Fuel V1 TM.
Yeah. So.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, I was just saying it's difficult to say whether the users have voiced their preference or not, because the only trust minimized bridge that we currently have has $8 on it, and it's a payment only rollup. So yeah, once we have more established infrastructure that is actually trust minimized, then it will be much easier to tell. But right now, we're just like, it's just a guessing game at this point.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. And it's just an interesting thing that I want to note, at least related to Celestia, is that like, although we currently do not have any way to support a trust minimized bridge to any of the rollups built on top of Celestia, we had Mustafa posted an idea on our forum recently about how we can actually bake that in a really state minimized way using like ZK rollups and having a verification opcode on Celestia. So anyway, what's really interesting is that the funny thing is that the motivation for doing that had nothing to do with providing settlement for like rollups built on top of Celestia, but actually it's kind of the reverse. Is that we realized that there might be demand for a trust minimized bridge for the Celestia token up to the rollups. And so it's funny because I don't know, just like the opposite of what people were complaining. Oh, Celestia, it's like you need settlement for the rollups, but actually Celestia needs that capability more for itself in a sense. So it's kind of like this ironic twist of fate, in my view. I again want to kind of like keep things on the topic of like the way that these ideas will actually change the systems that we build, and we're also kind of running up on time. So it's kind of like a last question. We have Toghrul from Scroll and also Kelvin as part of the Optimism team, both building rollups. I'm curious, in light of this debate and this conversation, is there anything that you guys are going to change about the architecture of your rollups that potentially make them skew more sovereign? Like, will there be peer-to-peer gossiping of fraud or validity proofs, or just in general, like how does this change the way that you guys think about what you guys are building?
Kelvin, do you want to go or should I go? All right, I'll go. We've been discussing peer-to-peer propagation of proofs for quite a long time. I'm not sure if there's a lot of benefit right now because it takes quite a non-negligible amount of time to produce a proof right now. So the benefits skew towards optimistic rollouts because it makes more sense for them right now. But I feel like at some point, once the proof systems get efficient enough where proofs can be propagated quite fast, I feel like it would make sense to propagate the proofs prior to publishing them and verifying them on chain, because then you can have stronger confirmation, off-chain confirmation than you can get right now. But we're still quite a long way away from that being like necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything that I'm going to change today with a lot of this stuff. It's, part of it obviously is, OP mainnet is the way it is, and there are a lot of systems, building on top of the OP stack that are taking making very similar assumptions and creating very similar architectures and relying on Ethereum in this way. And so for those systems, I'm more interested in just observing how this shift of the dynamics of social consensus happens over time. But yeah, I'm much more interested in this from the perspective of new potential systems that make completely different assumptions, and sort of the space that you have available to you to design within that.
Very fair. Yeah. I mean, I coming from putting my Celestia hat on, essentially, we really believe strongly that users should be like directly verifying chains. And so to me, that's why we push so hard on this idea of people running light nodes and making the hardware requirements like extremely minimal and all of that. And so I think part of that is like peer-to-peer fraud proofs. I mean, I guess it's not necessary, but I personally find that model of like verifying in a peer-to-peer nature like just more like philosophically aligned. So anyway, I hope more rollups kind of move in that direction, because I think a lot of the rollups to date have been sort of based around this more smart contract model of security, and sort of using that as a central point of their network. Anyway, so I want to wrap things up. I guess we can go around and everyone can give their final thoughts or takeaways or like last messages for the audience, and like just tell us like what you think, where things are at, where should we go from here, what are the most important things that you want people to take away from this conversation.
So for me, I'll just quickly mention like some of the important like kind of upshots of this. One is obviously what you're talking about, just like, I mean, at just a simple technical level, like people kind of reevaluating what does it mean to really settle. In other words, like how are we distributing proofs and like making different observers aware of that, and realizing that like there is a different space that you can work in where you could distribute them P2P. You could post them to a bridge. You can have like multiple different chains which have a validating bridge that you're like quote unquote settling to. There's all different kinds of contracts there. And then also the very kind of bigger things relate to kind of like the changing kind of like power dynamics and how we think about this. In particular, a lot of what like James was mentioning of it seems highly likely that native USDC and CCTP, something like that is going to probably grow like quite meaningfully, and probably not even take like that long to do that. And like that has meaningful implications both on just like safety perspectives for users, but also just like who is actually controlling the different assets in these chains, and just like having a better understanding of like what influence does Circle have over a different role, like what is like fundamentally the task of on-chain governance that is controlling this bridge, like what are they actually tasked with and what power do they have versus like what is the social consensus like responsible for, and like what opt-out do they have in this system, and that's going to look very different in different systems. So just like understanding like the interplay and the actual responsibilities of different parties in those as new chains look very different is just like a fundamentally important thing that like I think we need to think a lot about on that like kind of governance and social consensus level.
Beautifully said. James, Toghrul?
For me, I think I don't build rollups. I work on a bunch of different things in the space, and all of these semantic arguments on Twitter are about truth seeking. Is if you're not going to evaluate and reevaluate your prior knowledge about technical systems as they evolve and progress, and as the dialogue in the space evolves, you will not understand what is going on. Understanding rollups is going to be critical to the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years of this space. And if you get stuck in the legacy understanding of rollups as a client state of another blockchain, you're going to get very confused over the next couple years.
Could not agree more. Kelvin, Toghrul, give us your closing thoughts.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like we're gonna continue having this debate and arguments for quite a long time, especially since the space is progressing quite fast, and every other week someone's coming up with some new idea and some new construction that changes the way we see things. And so, yeah, it's just you're probably gonna hear us and see us arguing on Twitter for quite a long time.
I guess my only statement is, live in nuance, understand nuanced reality, and be comfortable with it.
Nice. Some real wisdom. Well, thank you guys all for coming. I mean, there's still so much more to talk about, and I think the Twitter debates will continue. And but ultimately, what's great is like we can all disagree on certain aspects of this, but the more we talk, hopefully the further and like refined these ideas become and the clearer they get. And I really appreciate that you guys and a lot of other people have been engaging in this conversation and sharing your knowledge and advancing the conversation. So thanks for coming on. And yeah, we'll see you on the Twitterverse.